Hi, everybody. Welcome to Zeal Zaddy. My name is Scott. My pronouns are he, him. And this is Story Talk, where every picture tells a story. Tonight, we're going to be talking about... Oh, before I get to that, for my YouTube viewers, when this is on YouTube, don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe. Maybe even comment. That'd be amazing. And I do want to offer a trigger warning on tonight. Tonight, it has some potentially heavy topics that may be of concern as we discuss culture, gender identity, current historical trauma, maybe even politics. We'll come into it. I'm not exactly sure. I don't know where it'll go, but I do want to give everyone that warning in case. So, sensitivity reading. Why do we need sensitivity readers? What do they do? Sensitivity readers give feedback on your writing from a perspective, usually a different one than your own, to help you discover the hidden biases that have found their way into your writing. They don't change your writing. They give guidance and let you decide what should be kept and what should be changed. When at the top of their game, a sensitivity reader looks to help you bring a mostly authentic representation from the point of view you may miss. I say mostly because they also sometimes want to avoid the authentic in histories fraught with cultural divisiveness or trauma, pointing out those concerns to you also. As the writer, you can better understand what your words carry, to help the writer better understand what their words carry to the ears or the minds of their readers. Please welcome Monroe Soto, Junie B, and Leona Maples. All right, welcome everybody. I'm so happy that I got the three of you here. I think this is going to be just an amazing show. Why don't we let all of you go around and say who you are, where they can find you, and your socials. I'll drop them in chat. I'm sure you'll get some followers tonight because everybody should be following you anyway. So why don't we start with you, Leona, and go clockwise around.
Sure, absolutely. Hello, my name is Leona. You can find me on the social media platforms as the Leona Maple. The best place to keep up with what on earth it is that I'm doing and all of my numerous projects is theleonamaple.card.co. And I always try to update it with as much information about what I've got going on. So if you ever want to know all of the various cookie jars that I've got my hands in, that's where you should look. And my pronouns are she, her.
All right. Junie.
Hey everybody, I'm Junie. I use she, her, or them pronouns. You can find me everywhere. Twitter, and I'm going to keep calling it Twitter forever.
Me too.
Co-host Blue Sky. You can find me at Stellar Empress. If you want to keep up with what I'm currently writing or editing, or you want to book me for something, you can find me at stellarcreative.card.co. And yeah, I'm just really grateful to be here and chat with all y'all.
All right, and Monroe.
Hey there, I'm Monroe. You can find me on Twitter at Monroe98, Blue Sky, and most other socials at Monroe, or on Instagram at Monroe Gaming, and I use he, they pronouns. I'm also a writer, editor, and game designer, and you can find most of my work at monroe.card.co.
Awesome. As a note, if you have a question you want to ask of the guests, please put question before it in chat to make it easy for me to spot, because sometimes it can get busy in chat and it'll fly up and I'll miss it. But I do want to get your questions in as well as the ones I have. I have more questions we could possibly talk about in 2 hours, but I'm going to jump right in because I think we want to eat all the time with them, not me. So I'll start with the simplest one. What sensitivities do you read for? Like, what are the topics that you, I guess, specialize in? You'll have to tell me exactly how the industry is. Is it a specialization? Is it, you tell me. What do you read for? And anybody can jump in.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it like okay, so the way sensitivity reading kind of works is it's kind of informed by your lived perspective and your lived experience. So it's kind of strange to call it, I have a specialization in South Asian culture, because I simply am South Asian, you know. But because of that, I do read for South Asian culture, I read for queerness, asexuality, and demisexuality, along with a number of other things, ADHD, and Usually the best way to know if I can read for something is to just ask. If it falls into the things that I have lived experience with, I definitely can. The one aspect that I personally would argue I have a specialization in, yes, ADHD Club represent, is helping authors that are dealing with fantasy settings and really helping them kind of unpack that. I've done a lot of work within the tabletop RPG space, especially when it comes to D&D and fantasy settings and fantasy racism. So I do feel I've developed a book of experience there, and I feel like I can comfortably say that I specialize in that area of knowledge.
Nice.
For me, as a Mexican American, that's the number one thing I've actually been hired for to consult on, is that my ethnicity and my culture. I also read because I am bipolar. A lot of mental health, particularly with that, is important because it's usually misrepresented a lot. I also do anything resulting in consulting in fat phobia, witchcraft, because I am a practitioner actually. So in what I can as a curandero.
Nice.
And that's mainly what I've read for.
And I typically read for questions of Black culture, of queer culture, neurodivergence, especially where anxiety, ADHD, and depression mix. And one thing I'm asked for a lot is perspective on being Black in majority white spaces, especially STEM. My personal preference is working with fantasy, but my background is in biochemistry, and going through all of that, it brings... It's a very specific set of experiences, and people who are looking for that usually come to me for it.
I think it's cool that you have biochemistry,
really
science is
cool,
a background.
actually.
That's so awesome.
So cool.
On Twitter, I have a list that I built of TTRPG people that are in STEM. I'm gonna have to add you to that list. And there's a lot of them. I mean, I don't even think people realize how many people are in STEM in this field. It shouldn't be surprising because the field is full of smart people. So I guess that's how it happens. So here's one of the nicest questions there is. What's one of your proudest pieces of work that you've got your name on?
Fairly recently, actually, this last year, I was a sensitivity reader for a project called Cloud Empress, which is a mothership, based off Mothership.
Nice.
Cool.
And it was a lot of body horror. Big bugs, it was really cool, and I'm really happy to be a part of that project.
Cool. Anybody else want to?
Sorry, what project to shout out? I've been lucky. I'm very spoiled. I've worked on a bunch of cool projects, and I have trouble deciding which one to shout out all the time because they're all really neat. I will say I got to do some really cool World of Darkness work, and I think that was one that I absolutely lost my mind over being able to work on. Werewolf 5th edition and Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition was definitely a feather in my cap that I was really proud of.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Cool.
Y'all are killing it out here. I actually haven't done a lot of sensitivity words. I haven't done a lot of sensitivity reading work for TTRPGs. I'm hoping to do more. But a book I'm really proud of reading for is... what was it called? In Search of Superpowers, a fantasy pin world adventure. It was... it's a kid's fantasy book.
Okay. Wonderful.
But it draws on so much of, urban and suburban Black and queer culture in the South. And
so cool.
I was right at home with it. It was so much fun.
That's so cool.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
So something that I ran into over the last few weeks, and I started to wonder about it. I'm getting ready to do an actual play of Old Gods of Appalachia, and I wondered, do sensitivity readers work with people getting ready to run actual plays? There is a lot of controversy that can happen in there too, and there could be ways that you could be given guidance on how to handle. I mean, Appalachia in 1920 was not a nice place, and there was a lot of trauma to people at the time. And I was wondering if that actually is a thing or not, or maybe I just created it. Oh my God. You might have a whole new line.
It's definitely a thing. It is a thing that I have definitely done. For example, over on Neon Lights Roleplay, I was very proud of supporting a show called The Violet Sea. In the season finale of the show, one of the player characters plays the captain of the ship, who is a freed, was a black former slave who was then freed and then became the captain of the ship. And in this finale, he confronts his slaver. And the GM is playing the role of this NPC slaver, and he's a white guy, and this is, a black person of color playing this player character, and the GM's like, whoa, man, how do I do this, and so it looked a bit like us sitting down in the background, having a chat, making sure that the person, the black person as a player character was able to express, like, these are things that I'm comfortable with, these are things that I'm not comfortable with, the GM also expressing kind of where their comfort boundaries are, and us kind of as a team working together to kind of figure out what that narrative would look like and when the kind of cutaway points are. Wow. And that one was one of my favorite versions of that. I was also kind of in chat, making sure chat was kind of prepared and aware of that this was going to happen. I was also in the group chat for the entire cast to make sure that they were okay, as well as a direct line with everyone that was kind of involved in those scenes. I've talked to a bunch of actual plays. I've helped a bunch of actual play communities out.
Wow.
Helped them out with background stuff. It's always a really cool time. The best thing about sensitivity reading is that it applies to just about everything. And once you start to see the opportunities, it's a great time. It's a great place to be.
Awesome. Have either of you, the other two, done any sensitivity reading or sensitivity work, I guess, with actual plays?
Not to that extent, no. I mean, I guess for me personally, I know I would love to. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But I feel like this is why, as a short tangent, why session zeros and safety tools are so important, because that's the closest thing a lot of people have to a sensitivity consultant, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And I think that's having another person who's like, hey, maybe not do that, especially at tables who are unfortunately all white or all non-marginalized identities decide to play as marginalized identities, and like there's no one to tell you no and you should fix that.
Yeah. Like, there are definitely ways to do it well, but there's a lot of you don't know what you don't know sometimes, and that's where we come in.
Yeah, that's true. That's super true. we can walk into things totally by accident and be like, oh my God, where did we just go? We should have avoided that.
All the time.
Yeah.
It happens all the time where people that are well-meaning and with the best of intentions accidentally walk into something, and I've had to definitely approach certain tables and be like, hey, not mad at you. I'm just letting you know that this is kind of the impression that you're giving off, and like helping them kind of navigate that is always, it's always for the better.
All right. So when you do your reading, do you mark offensive language? And when you do, how do you determine what is offensive within a particular piece of work?
For me, it depends on the type of language and what idea you're trying to represent. Because obviously, you can look at any language and go, you could word that better. For me, it's like reading any tabletop that's come out in the last 10 years and you see the word crazy or insane to describe something that's out of this world or wild, and it's like, you could have worded that way better and not had to have used ableist language, because obviously it's so ingrained in everyday language that people will just say that, or even something like something's lame, and it's like, you don't have to use that kind of language in something like that. Or I'm trying to think of what other examples I have. Those are the main ones I have.
So when you're doing that, do you give them suggestions, or do you just mark it as being problematic and say why?
I tend to give them suggestions. always have a thesaurus ready with me at any point in reading, just because it does help. It's like, I know what idea you're trying to convey. Here's the best word for it, or a better word for it.
Okay.
Yeah. So much of it is context dependent, right? And on the client's intention, right? Like, what is your intention? What is your goal? What is the actual message that you're trying to get across? And based upon that is kind of how I will evaluate what fits and what doesn't fit, and what is offensive and what is not, right? Because, you know, it's not about taking out all of the offensive stuff. It's about taking out the stuff that doesn't fit and the stuff that is unnecessary or extraneous, right? If you are attempting to show oppression and marginalization for, you know, a good purpose and a good, like you know, and we've discussed that, why would I remove that, you know? And so it starts with that kind of intention and what the goal is, and then going into that and figuring out in detail kind of like what needs to stay and what doesn't, and definitely always providing alternatives and suggestions. And, you know, I always say, like, here's a rewritten example. Feel free to copy paste it or write your own, right? Folks can take as many of my suggestions. I try to make it as easy for people to take them, so that they don't feel like I'm just being like, this is bad, and then leaving them hanging.
Right.
You know, no one ever wants that. I know some folks have had that negative type of experience before with sensitivity readers, but I think a good sensitivity reader will always try to give you suggestions of like how to make things better and give you an idea, and then it's up to you to, like, you can take it or you can come up with your own alternative, you know?
Nice. Anything, Joni, you want to add?
Honestly, I think y'all hit the nail on the head pretty hard.
Okay.
I will say, building on that, period pieces especially, or things that draw on specific, like, historical settings, they can be difficult to navigate for that exact same reason. Like, you want it to fit, and you want it to be appropriate to what you're trying to capture or represent, but finding where the line for, like, necessity is, and helping them draw it so it's both clear and consistent throughout whatever they're doing. It can be challenging, but it's definitely important.
Nice. Speaking of consistency, I have a good question on consistency. So, how do you maintain consistency in and across product lines if you're not the only sensitivity reader for all the products? And is there a shared vision, like document or meeting or something that you would use to establish a language between the sensitivity readers and the other editors or writers?
That'd be nice. That'd be so nice.
That would be.
That would be
Wouldn't
so nice. The way the industry kind of works at the moment is a lot of times sensitivity readers are brought in freelance and brought in individually, and there's not a lot of cross communication. There is a benefit to having individual perspectives because every sensitivity reader will have a unique perspective. But the opportunities where I've been able to speak with my colleagues because I knew who they were, it does help a lot because I'm able to not only confirm, you know, things that I may have noticed, but they're able to point out things that I didn't notice because every sensitivity reader comes with a different set of expertise. And I think that especially allows for consistency. At this point, there really isn't a project that I've encountered where we have like a sensitivity stylistic manual of things. But what I do find is I do tend to kind of like give my clients that, where I'm like, hey, for these concepts, here's kind of how you should generally treat them, you know? And so I think because we lack that sort of ability to create those guidelines or have those guidelines, and I don't know if either of you have experienced this, but I tend to find that I tend to like give that to my clients and be like, here's how you should treat this moving forward, you know, as you, like, for example, as you continue this novel series, here's how you should treat this, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think we tend to try and equip our clients.
I have done that for sure. There was a podcast I helped because there was a Mexican American character, and it was trying not to. There was another sensitivity reader on the project, and they basically said everything I was already thinking as I was reading through it. And it was just make sure, because a lot of the stuff fell into the, like, no sabo kid stereotype, and we were both just like, maybe here's what you don't do continuing forward. Like it's fine. Like this is fine about that character, but there is some consistency that's like you can't keep doing that throughout the entire media.
Yeah. Like, I can think of a handful of instances where I've gotten to work with another sensitivity reader on a project, and it's usually for like a big project. So they need to draw on a lot of experience on it.
Do you leer at each other across the room? Like, ooh, are you taking my job?
No.
No.
The
You're all
joy of
friends.
sensitivity reading.
Okay.
No, we're all friends. The joy of sensitivity reading
Yeah.
is that it is one industry where I will gladly refer people, because if it's not my expertise, someone else is getting paid. Why would I take that from them? Like, sensitivity reading is such a win-win industry, and especially when I get to work with my colleagues, it's like, oh my god, you're here! Hey! Like, you know?
It's the more the
always-
merrier.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. I've never seen an industry that's more the merrier, honestly.
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity here for like a sensitivity reader business book, like
There
to
is.
talk about
There is.
building consistency across lines and stuff. Like,
It's tough. I know I said this kind of before the stream, because this industry is a little bit of a wild west. We're all kind of scattered all over the place, and collecting everybody in one place is kind of like part of the work as a sensitivity reader, is like finding the other people and knowing who they are, because I often have to do referrals, or like, you know, just finding other people to bounce thoughts off of. It can be a lonely time, and it's, you know, I think as this industry continues to develop, I think we'll start to see books and like kind of groups pop up more and more. The Hitchhiker's Guide to Sensitivity Territory.
that was a great title.
No, that's great.
I love that.
So much.
Obviously, we're all well read enough to know to get the joke too. Just like everybody in this industry. Everybody in this industry has read a lot. Just everybody. The artists have read a lot. The writers. I mean, obviously the writers. Everybody. So from that perspective, then, so what do you expect from your publishers? How much of what you offer is rejected by them, and what is their feedback when they do this? I assume that there's some rejection of your guidance, right? Just like with an editor, there's going to be rejection of some editor's guidance.
Absolutely. I can speak to the literature part of that. Like, with any other editor, we give suggestions because we want to help the writers, the authors, the publishers. We want to help everyone succeed at what they're trying to do. But because we are one person, we're a small group of people coming in to bring our perspective, they're not going to accept everything, because not everything is going to line up with how they want it to look at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that's fine. It's just kind of the expectation that comes with working with other people's creative visions. These are their babies.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, you're putting your hands into another creative's creation, and a lot of creatives are very protective and nervous of sharing that creation. Although this is one of what I think are the two most collaborative industries. There's filmmaking and TTRPG development. I don't think there's another industry on the same level of collaboration to really make it work. Yeah, there are auteurs, but there's very few.
I always, like, if there's something that is like really flagrant, I will always specifically call it a red flag, and I'll be like, this is a red flag, this should not pass. And whenever I do that, I always try to kind of back it up with as much why as possible, right? I never want to kind of give a client a hard no without a, like, here's why, and like help them understand. But at the end of the day, I tend to like have more clients, because it's not necessarily. Sometimes I might get hired through a publisher. A lot of the times I'm getting hired by authors themselves, or by people that are, you know, working on the writing, and so on and so forth. Always cite your sources, absolutely. And so I try to always kind of give as much why, and at the end of the day, if they say no, it is what it is. I did the best that I could, and that's kind of all that matters, you know? But I find that the rejection level is, like, not a whole lot. Like, it's usually, like, for the most part, I feel like the folks who kind of bring us on are usually pretty willing to hear what we have to say, and, like, most of the time the response is, "Oh shit, I didn't think about that," you know. Every now and again they're like, "No," but I feel like most clients are fairly receptive. At least I've had good luck with that.
Good.
No, and I have too, especially because it's like,
maybe y'all have had bad situations.
no, I have not had any bad situations, thankfully. But it's also that thing of like, well, you hired a sensitivity reader in the first place, so you at least have that in mind.
Right.
Have you ever reached out to somebody who didn't hire you? Like, have you ever reached out to a publisher and said, you could use my services? Because I'm sure the ones that don't hire you are the ones that need them most.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have, and I usually just don't hear anything back. It is what it is.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
They're not there yet, right? They don't have that awareness yet. And when they have that awareness, they'll start having those conversations. But until they have that awareness, it's not worth me kind of like throwing myself on a brick wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had suggested earlier that we're kind of in the Wild West. So are there any especially good references or people that helped you become better at becoming a sensitivity reader, or even to get into the industry as a sensitivity reader?
If I'm honest, Leona.
Oh.
Yeah.
You were actually the first sensitivity reader I'd like seen out in the wild. So, oh God, when was that? Like early 2021. I think that's when I first put out that call, just like asking people how you do it. And like maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I got like a really small publisher like asking if they could give me a chance to like get started, and I haven't looked back.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's why I carry this torch so loudly and intensely, is because it is a Wild West, and because, you know, it always makes me happy to hear that folks have started this journey because I was able to yell about it loud enough and like draw enough attention to it. It's sincerely, if I can use a language, it was a lot of stumble fuckery. It was a lot of fuck around and find out. It really was. Everything I have learned by the seat of my pants. And that was just kind of how it is, because it's such a new industry. It feels like it's a Wild West, and it's like there's no real set guidelines or anything like that. It's like I said, I bear this torch, and so my brain is constantly like, how can I bring the sensitivity readers together? How can I give them all a sense of uniformity? Like, I keep trying to do this thing, and maybe I
just needed story talk.
I just needed story talk. Maybe
we'll
I need to be
Next
stopped.
year.
I will say the one kind of experience that I had that I feel like really kind of helped give me part of that sense of uniformity was joining Salt and Sage Books. I subcontract for Salt and Sage Books, and they're a wonderful part of the book publishing industry more so. But they also do tabletop RPGs and other kinds of media as well. Anything that you get a sensitivity reader for, they'll gladly help. And because they had such a plethora of sensitivity readers, they started doing some of that work of like, here's our expectations, here's how long your editor's letter should be, here's what we're kind of looking for, you know? And it was kind of like, oh, okay, like, you know, having that set of expectations, I think, really helps, because then the client knows what to expect. So, yeah, it's a lot of background to find out, and I'm hoping one day to not make it that way. But that's Leona's long-term goals and dreams. Like, we don't gotta go into that.
Monroe, are there any?
I'm really happy.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I was gonna say I'm really happy to hear that I was able to like do that for you.
So Monroe, any good references or people that helped bring you into the industry, or that you looked up to as a way to find your way in?
I was also going to say Leona, and then yeah, because I think you were also one of the first I saw, because I didn't realize it was an industry you could do, something you could do, until like I saw you and a few others. I'm sure I'll remember their names later. It was like several people, like especially people of color, who were like, yeah, this is an industry, and you can look for and be hired for. And I was like, oh, especially because I was seeing the misrepresentation in certain media and being like, I could fix that.
Mm-hmm.
So you say it's an industry. When did this actually become an industry? It's so new. Like, is it still becoming an industry, or is it established as an industry? That may be a bigger question than you can answer. I'm not sure.
I will say that I think within the book publishing and the literature industry, it's been around a little bit longer. The Editorial Freelancers Association, a couple years before the pandemic, did a survey of their clients, not their clients, but their membership, and asked folks what their rates were. And so there was sensitivity readers put out on that sheet. So it's existed for a number of years now. I think we're just seeing it being adopted more and more, and it's become more of a conversation piece. But I do believe sensitivity readers have been around in the industry for both tabletop and novels and other areas for a good number of years, actually. It's just something that, again, has only recently entered into like public knowledge, and like because more industries are diversifying, we're seeing more diverse media on TV, for example. So the need for sensitivity readers has grown, and so the industry has grown as a result. And I would say it's an industry, despite the fact that it's not quite organized just yet. It is an industry, and when you start to look at like Facebook groups where sensitivity readers collect, you realize that it is an actual industry, because there's tons of us. There's plenty of us.
Is it an industry that is, now that it's nascent, obviously, is it an industry that's under threat from AI?
No. AI cannot replicate. Not in the slightest. AI cannot do what we do.
We need a few things to survive.
No kidding.
No, this is the one industry that AI will never be able to touch, because AI does not understand humanity. AI will repeat what everyone says, but it will not, and maybe
which is terrible. That's the worst thing that's what should totally not happen.
Right? Yeah. Maybe AI can do a decent job. Maybe if you ask ChatGPT what is fantasy racism, it'll spit out a modicum of an honest answer. Maybe it will get to that point. But considering how nuanced every single project is, and considering how human emotion based it is, it's impossible for AI to replicate that. And it is impossible for someone who does not have the lived experience to do that job. I could never, ever sensitivity read for an Indigenous project, because I do not have the set of knowledge. So where these jobs are, they remain, and those seats remain open until they are filled. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of the nice part about it, you know? Yeah.
All right, here's a fun one. A new client comes to you, one you don't know, you don't know them, and maybe you've heard their name in the industry. How do you onboard them, and what expectations do you set for them? Because it's a two-way street, so you're onboarding them as well as they're onboarding you.
I tend to ask around from other people if they've worked with them. That tends to be my go-to, just to see who they are. Like, I'm a part of Utopia. I'm in that server, if you're aware of them. And that's the main one I go to, because it's full of other people of color and other marginalized people. And it's like, do you know this person? Have you heard good things? What are they like? And that tends to be where I start, because there are some people who I don't feel comfortable I wouldn't feel comfortable working with. And I would be straight up about that. I don't feel comfortable doing this.
Okay, but say you like them, how do you onboard them? How do you set expectations? What expectations do you set?
It's very similar to a session 0 for me. Mm-hmm. I would say is here, what is the project you're working on? What does it entail? How can I help you? Like, what are you coming to me for? So then I have a better chance of being like, okay, here's what I can do. I have references that you can look for from other people if there are things I can't help you with. Is where I would start in the first place.
I like that.
Similarly, it's always a lot of like, what's your project about? First and foremost, tell me what you're working on. Let me make sure that I'm the right fit for your project, right? Because sometimes folks come to me and they're like, oh, I'm working on this project, but it's, with this culture. And I'm like, I can't help you with that. I can only give you very general advice. And I can point out where you're going to need the other sensitivity reader, but I can't, So always, what is your project? What is your timeline? What questions do you have for me? How much do you know about sensitivity reading? If you don't know anything, let me tell you what to kind of expect from this, So a lot of those kind of generalized questions like that, and kind of just like trying to set expectations, try to give them an idea of like an understanding of what their needs are, especially before we kind of get into it, just to make sure that I can address those needs. It is definitely a two-way. It's an interesting two-way street for sure. But I always think a lot of folks that come to me, especially since some of them have never contacted a sensitivity reader before, it's always a lot of that like filling them in on how this works and giving them an idea of what to expect, and asking them what kind of like brought them to me, like what are those questions that they have burning in their brain, so that I can be like, hey, this is a space where you can ask any question. It's okay. I got you. Let's figure it out together, and then it becomes a collaborative process from there.
What about you, Junie?
It's mostly the same for me. I get work from a couple of different people aside from like independent contact. Specifically the write-up and writing diversely, and usually when I have a client come in through them, most of that information will already be available. So when I reach out to that client for the first time, I try to get as much of their perspective on what they're writing, how do I phrase this? I think the biggest question I always try to kick things off with is, what are you trying to accomplish, and how can I help you get there? Every book, every game, every show it's trying to do something specific. Or if they don't have something specific, they're just trying to see where to go. And I want to be able to tailor my advice, my guidance, my sources to what they're trying to accomplish. And I think just like trying to get in the author's head from the get-go helps me do that.
All right. I think this next question should start with you because, Junie. So how do you handle sensitivity reading for writers writing from historical context?
Carefully.
That's real.
Usually, I start by doing some research on that time period. With like the chronological age era and the setting. It's, oh god, what was that book called? Said the Gaslit. I don't know if it's out yet. It's been a while since I read for it, but it was like Wild West America, and bring a little bit of fantasy into it, but still dealing with all of the various isms of the time. So I started digging into the way that people in that time period spoke, what the major tensions were, and how they would fold into the details of that book. And I try to cross-reference that with my modern understanding of like the intersection of like various forms of bigotry and just the social pressures then versus now, and trying to meet them in the middle.
Yeah, carefully.
Carefully.
Just like you said.
A lot of research, a lot of sources.
Before you ever put any words to them back.
Yeah. Because you want to make sure you do it right, you know?
Yeah. And there is I think there's a value in respecting the history without allowing the history to dictate perception, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where a lot of writers in TTRP from like old school writers they're in that nexus point where these are coming together. And that's why I think the games today are so much better than the games from 25 years ago. They're just amazing today. We're in the golden age of TTRPGs for a reason, I think, and I think this is part of it. So the other two of you, Monroe and Leona, what about you about historical context?
I think seconding Judy, it's a lot of research, especially if it's about a time period you're not as familiar with, or I don't want to say not interested in, because obviously there are time periods where, at least as a neurodivergent person, I tend to gravitate towards. So it's, again, very carefully, because you have to look at what was the norm of this time period versus through a modern lens, and then take that.
Yeah, I generally don't have much to add. The one thing I will say is that history is always written by the winners. And that, like, common history is always written by the winners. As a South Asian person, there are things about my own history that I do not know because I live in Canada, and, I only, within the last 6 months, learned about Winston Churchill's perspectives and opinions about Mahatma Gandhi, which were not very nice. Probably feels like something I maybe wanted to have learned in school, but that's the nature of the world that we live in, is history is written by those that win. And that means that it's a lot of digging into the other side of history, too. And making sure that those other voices, the historically marginalized voices, are also being heard. So it is a lot of very careful work, and it can be very heavy. And if anyone is dealing with historical fiction, I advise you to just be aware of how heavy it is to kind of work with, and how much of a load it puts on your sensitivity reader. I sensitivity read for a book for Partition Era India, and I think I had to take about 2 weeks off afterwards, because it was such a heavy book, and it was so real, and every single punch was thrown about how women were treated. And even though I was born and raised in Canada, have nothing to do with Partition Era India, it is still a generational thing. And it was like, to read through that book was such a big oof. And it was just, I spent about 2 weeks after being like, I'm not working, because I just needed time off. And I think that is something that folks should keep in mind, is that it is a level of emotional labor, especially when we're doing historical things. A lot of things, I can bounce off of them and bounce to the next project, but historical fiction in particular, I have found, is a heavier one. So if you are contracting a sensitivity reader, if you are a sensitivity reader, things to keep in mind.
Loudly seconding that. I think something a lot of people who aren't familiar with this industry don't really understand is how emotionally exhausting the work can be, because we are subjected to some very challenging or deeply culturally unpleasant things, and having to relive them even in second person, it's a lot to go through, even with well-intentioned books. And the worst of them
are well-intentioned.
Not well-intentioned.
No, that's about the kindest thing you could say.
I will be very transparent. There are set, safe people when I sensitivity read who know that if I'm having a really rough sensitivity read, I'm going to come to them to vent. And they know. They know
it's
who
good
they
you
are.
have that support.
You need to have that support as sensitivity readers, because, well, speaking of Lovecraft, actually, but I won't go into Lovecraft. But no, it is heavy, and it's, there are folks who know that if I am working on something, I will come and vent to them, because I need to be able to output the frustration somewhere, Like I said, we become sensitive readers because of our lived experience, and it doesn't always make it easier, We are, when we come across those things, even in a document that we are reading, we feel that those things in our gut, in our chest, in our bodies. And a lot of folks don't realize that, that this has a physical impact, not just on my brain, but also on my body. And that's why you need time off to recuperate and to recover, and why kind of like when I work through something, it digested me in an almost literal sense, you know. So yeah, it is an aspect that is not often talked about, but I think is so important to let people know about, is that it is emotional. Especially if we have to do the work then of like being upset, coming back to you as a client calmly, and then doing the labor of explaining calmly why this is a problem, you know. And we've had to let out all of this pain and anguish elsewhere so that we can give you that excellent customer support that is inherent in the job, you know. But it is just something to keep in mind, and we know oftentimes the clients are well-intentioned. We're still going to take that out elsewhere because that's not, you know, it's not necessarily your fault, but we're still going to do our jobs.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did you want to add anything to this, Monroe?
That was mostly what I can't really add anything to that. That was perfectly said. Because I have noticed it's, and while I'm going to admit, I haven't done nearly as much sensitivity reading as probably the other two have done. It is exhausting at times, and people need to consider that when hiring people. Like, oh, maybe especially if you have a subject that requires multiple sensitivity readers, you should be aware of why that might be emotionally exhausting.
Okay, so we talked, I had mentioned earlier, we didn't talk about it yet, but I mentioned earlier that we're an industry filled with smart people, right? Does knowledge of a subject make someone more or less sensitive to its perspectives? Or does it have no effect? By being smart, are you more likely to be sensitive to the topics that you're writing about, or does it have any effect on people, do you think?
Yes and no.
I was
Okay.
gonna say
Yeah. Go on.
This day's all about the gray. We can all live in the gray the whole time. Totally happy with
Welcome
that.
to sensitivity reading. It's all gray.
Yeah, I would say just because you're smart about a subject doesn't necessarily... You can be smart about the science of something or about a historical event and still be unaware of why something in that historical event was problematic.
Exactly. Like, sometimes coming in with a lot of knowledge about a subject can be as helpful as it is damning. Because if you're confident you know everything that is relevant about something when you're bringing it in, you can very quickly overlook a lot of sensitive topics that you just wouldn't think to question or wouldn't think of in a particular light. So it's good when people are already informed of something because it gives you a lot to go off of. But at the same time, sometimes there is some unlearning that has to be done before that information can be corrected.
And to bounce off of that, like, because this is an industry full of smart people, you know, a lot of the folks that I work with are very, like, social justice oriented, and they're like, oh, well, you know, I'm approaching you because I want to make sure that I don't have any fantasy racism in my game. Okay, great. Awesome. Cool. You're already kind of familiar with the vibe. That does not mean that you, despite your best intentions, that you've managed to solve for that in your game already. And oftentimes with folks who are aware of those things, I'll kind of be like, have you considered that maybe this depiction of this fantasy race is kind of looking a little this way? And because they are smart, it saves me from having to do the why, because I'll say that much and they'll be like, oh, you're right, shoot, you know? And like, yeah, but we are all going to have blind spots when it comes to our own work. We're all going to miss things, you know? It's hard to see, what's that saying? The forest from the trees? Is that the saying? Trees from the forest?
Yeah, you can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah. And when you're so deeply immersed in your own project, sometimes you're just going to miss things, you know? Despite how activist you are, how aware you are, how well read you are, you're still going to miss things. And sensitivity readers are this wonderful outside perspective that can kind of come in and just kind of be like, have you considered this? And yeah, if you're well read, great. I don't have to explain it to you because as soon as I say it, you already know why. But it happens all the time. Folks just happen to miss things, and that's okay.
Well, we have hit.
Also,
oh, go on. Sorry, go on, Monroe.
sorry, no, you're good. And also, some people come in with their own, I don't want to say prejudices, but with their own ideas of how things should be, or like you were saying, Leon, about how some people they're smart enough to be aware, but they still, growing up coming from somewhere that is not very diverse, a lot of people will have ideas of what they think diversity should look like. And they try to represent that, and it just comes off as not what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize this thing about this. I read all these. For example, I've read all these articles about South Asian culture. I'm pretty sure it looks like this, and I'm like, close but no cigar. And here's a more accurate depiction. People well-meaning, people try their best, but it does not always land. And so, yeah. It's always really helpful when I can be like, I see that you've done your research, because that happens a lot. Is I get clients who have done their research, and I appreciate them for it, but they've still missed a couple of things, and that makes it easy because I'm like, cool, I know you're trying your best. Here's where I can kind of come in and help fix all of the things that you missed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've hit the midway point. I do want to take a few minute break for everybody to have their biologics taken care of. During the intermission, I run. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry. Before we get started, I do want to let you know I want to give a trigger warning on the show tonight. There's some topics that may be of concern as we discuss culture, gender identity, potentially religion, which I forgot to mention, which I do have a question or two coming up on that, current and historical traumas, and maybe even politics. So if any of those are topics that would concern you or you would have issues with, it may be a good idea to jump off. If not, tell all your friends to jump on right now. All right. If you have questions, just put question in chat before it. All right. The devil has entered the room. Dun, dun, dun. So I will say I did ask about these questions in advance to make sure that they were appropriate and they would be handled with respect. So the first one is, overall, writers are smart, well-read, introspective people. Do they need a sensitivity reader? Can't they already see the various perspectives and validate them without outside guidance?
We kind of brushed against this briefly.
We did a little bit.
About how some people will still have their own ideas of what something should be or how they think something should be, and it's like, well, not quite, because you haven't had that lived experience that would apply to that. Like, you can, or it's that idea of you can be of a marginalized identity, but that doesn't mean you can represent all marginalized identities.
True.
The exception that I always give to the rule is, like, if you are writing about your own lived experience, like, if I, chances are probably not, if a South Asian author is writing about South Asian content, they probably don't need a sensitivity reader, but I've definitely had other South Asian authors contract me as a sensitivity reader because they wanted a secondary perspective that was different than their own, so even when it is like your own subject matter area, you may still want a secondary opinion, a secondary perspective. So, there are some exceptions to the rule, but very few, honestly.
That was an easy one. Now I'm going to have to do the tough ones. Okay. A lot of OSR, which is old school revival creators, want historical accuracy. In quotes, historical accuracy. So how would that be handled if you were hired by one of those creators? I hate to say those. I don't even like to use the word like that. By a creator of that
Go off, Jamie. Go off.
I'm going to steal my answer from earlier and say carefully. Like, it's the same way that you do historical research for anything that requires it, I think. To borrow Leona's words, history is written by the victors, and as sensitivity readers doing historical research, we try our best to bring the perspectives of those who history tend to leave out. And I think if an OSR creator wants that emphasis on historical accuracy, then having voices like that is about as important as it gets. Because there's a lot they're not going to know they're missing. And without it, well, we've seen what happens. It can be rough.
Yeah. Especially for them.
Yeah.
I'm looking at you, TSR people. Sorry, I promised myself not to name names, but I had to throw that one in. I couldn't help it.
We all get one cheap shot.
Yeah, that was my cheap shot for the night.
How do y'all feel about this?
You said it all.
Yeah.
All right.
So the last of the devil's advocate questions. They get much easier and more fun after this one. So this one, there's a quote. I want to read this quote. It's from, in an article titled, "The Sensitive Topic of Sensitivity Readers," already right there in the face of sensitivity readers. An editor was complaining about a publisher stating, "Under the threat of having his book deal terminated, my client was forced to meaningfully modify his manuscript to accommodate a 5-page document full of subjective complaints about how the Vietnam War was fought by the author and his co-combatants. I actually agree with many of the sensitivity readers' sentiments. Everything about the Vietnam War was appalling. But why sanitize it? It should be depicted exactly as it happened. Following the publisher's logic would be equal to transforming the massacre into a misunderstanding with unpleasant consequences that shouldn't be discussed because it's too upsetting for some people. No appeals or rebuttals were allowed. My author reluctantly complied in full." I'll shut up now and let you guys talk.
No. As they said, they agreed with a lot of Sensitivity points, but why sanitize it? Absolutely. This is kind of why I say sensitivity reading can be a little bit of a Wild West, and why that seems like it wasn't quite the best matchup. Because that happens, Yeah, the Vietnam War was awful and terrible, and it seems like the sensitivity reader and the author's intention did not align there. Mm-hmm. I come across this a lot of times in tabletop RPGs in the form of, I want to have this evil. Or the thing that I get a lot is, you're a sensitivity reader, you're going to remove all of the evil from my game. Actually, no. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm not actually going to ask you to remove the slavery from your game if it is done correctly and done in a way that actually makes sense. If it's done in a way where you are not glorifying the slavery, and it is something that is meant to be overcome with guidelines and guidances, of course. Why would I remove it? Why would I sanitize your work? Why would I remove the thing that, as players, they get to resolve these things? Like, these are triumphs and things that can be, like, used for good, Obviously not the slavery, but, getting rid of a slavery.
Right, getting rid of it.
Right? So, it is unfortunate when these things happen. Sometimes, and because publishing... An interesting problem that's happening in the literary industry right now is publishing houses are realizing that sensitivity readers are important, and so they are requiring sensitivity readers. But when there is no alignment between the sensitivity reader and the author, you come into situations like this where things are not quite the way they should be, and so therefore things start to feel very sanitized, which clearly wasn't quite the right intention here, and that's just kind of part of that industry problem, that kind of like that sometimes that mismatch that happens, and that's why it's so important for there to be a space for conversation and feedback. And as you said in that passage, there was no room for that. There was no room for a back and forth. It was just, here's your feedback, accept it, or else we don't publish your book. And that's not quite how it needs to work. And so there's definitely kinks in the industry that got to be worked out.
Yeah. I also think there's a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, there are also some writers who are anathema to the idea of a sensitivity reader touching their work, you know. And over time, I do believe you have to allow time to do its job, and that kind of pushback is slowly being removed from the industry for the most part. I think it'll just take time. Some of the people, those 80-year-olds, are not going to be writing forever.
I think we touched on this a little bit ago. We are, at the end of the day, part of the editing process, no matter what we have our hands on. We're not trying to censor the authors, we're trying to help them succeed. And while not every author or publisher perfectly understands that, and there can absolutely be disconnects, like the example in the article, we are getting to a point where I think that's better understood. So I'm hopeful that it won't take long.
Anything you want to add, Monroe? Or has it been said?
I think it's pretty much been said. It's that it's just that, yeah, the disconnect, I think, is, and it's nice that at least for the TTRPG industry, we're not small enough, but just I don't know. It feels like it's easier than, I would say, a bigger publisher to find someone who fits with how small certain circles are, and being able to be like, hey, you need this one specific person for this one specific thing. Yeah. I got you. Yeah. I know a guy, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, this whole industry's like, 3 steps from Kevin Bacon kind of thing, where everybody's 1 or 2 people away from everybody else, like as far as connections.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's just not that big of an industry. We feel like it's big because we're in it, and it's so tiny, so tiny. So everybody knows or could find out about everybody else. So do you consider yourself, when you're reading and giving feedback, a writer or an editor?
Yes.
Wow, that's a good synchronization.
Good night, everybody. No.
We'll be here all week.
But it's true. We are both. We are coming at you as an editor, but because it's such a collaborative process, we end up doing some writing ourselves. And again, at the end of the day, it's up to the client to decide if they want to take our writing or not. But it's sensitivity reading literally straddles that line between writer and editor, and in a really funny way. So yes is the correct answer.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. I think it's great. Okay, this is a question that you can choose to answer or not. Do you feel you are compensated well enough for the benefits you give the companies you work for? Or you can just say, I don't want to answer that. And I'll totally not.
It's a slippery slope. It really depends on the project.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It really does. In some cases, hiring a sensitivity reader is a bit like having an insurance policy. I know that I, in my very early days, worked on a project where I red flagged something on a board game that was, probably lawsuit worthy.
Oh, wow.
So I probably, it was a religious inaccuracy, and I was like, you might get sued over that one. And I red flagged it, of course, and they were able to correct it before publishing. So I probably saved them, God, I don't know how many thousands or millions of dollars. And, they obviously, because they've got a good product, have a profit of thousands and millions of dollars. And I got one check out of it,
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a trade-off there,
Yeah, those lawyers took it all.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a trade-off there. And I think as sensitivity readers, we experience a lot of imposter syndrome. I know I did when I started. And like over the years, my rate has just gone up and up and up and up because I start to realize exactly like, you know, what that value is. But it's hard to get there and it's hard to ask for that and it's hard to sell that sometimes because it is a big number. So it's a slippery slope. It's tricky. It's gotten to the point now where I feel like I can ask for my worth, but I know that sometimes I price myself out from folks who do want to hire a sensitivity reader, but, you know, can't pay, you know, $100 an hour or whatever, you know?
Yeah, and I'm gonna admit, I haven't done any serious big projects like that, so I have to say no. I mean, the work was worth it. I loved doing the work. It was just smaller projects, so I didn't. Yeah, I've only done smaller projects, so I haven't done anything that would constitute as, that paid for what it was worth emotionally.
And
I understand.
And don't think you're special. I ask all the creators that because I'm kind of in my head, I'm trying to figure out, is this industry paying everybody well enough? And no, we're not.
No, we're not.
We totally are not.
We absolutely are not. I can tell you that for a fact. We absolutely are not. But yeah, no, it is definitely a lot of like.
Yeah.
Sometimes you undercut yourself because you really want to be a part of this project.
Yeah.
You know, it's heartache in this industry for sure sometimes.
So throughout a project, and at the end of your capacity in a project, what are your deliverables to a client? What do you give them? What do they get from you? Like physical and value add. Except peace of mind. They all get that. We'll just assume they get that.
For me, I usually, as a baseline, I give a 1 to 2 page edit letter, basically, detailing the strengths of their project, because everything succeeds at something. Everything has something that shines. Their specific concerns and other things that I caught, either things that needed to be corrected, usually with sources, or suggestions and rationale as to why. And I usually offer, if an author or a publisher has questions afterwards, a chance to just sit down and talk with me and get those questions answered or clarify anything that I might have written. Because I want to make sure that they're getting what they came here for out of it. What about y'all?
Oh, and in what form, by the way, Junie, do you give it to them? Is it paper? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Is it a Word document? What do you give?
It's usually
PDF?
a Word document.
Okay.
I have never worked with a project in person, so I do most of that work digitally.
Okay.
Sometimes I do like video chats with people, just like hour or 2 hour long consultations about things.
Nice.
And it's a lot of really long comments on Google Docs and emails for me.
Nice.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, same here. It's usually feedback letters. You know, always letting people know what the strengths are, letting them know what needs to be changed. Written feedback you will get 99.99% of the time. If you're not getting written feedback, how is your sensitivity reader helping you? I have questions. You know? I have questions. And if it's not a letter, it's usually sometimes it'll be like comments in like a Google Doc. Like some clients will prefer if I just comment directly, which I'm happy to do if it's smaller tweaks. If it feels like the entire structural of everything needs to be fixed, I will usually do like a letter. So it kind of depends on like the client needs and also like what I think is going to give them my feedback in the best route. And then usually lots of like all of that kind of feedback summed up in an email as well. And video calls are super important as well to kind of give that kind of back and forth and like that feedback and like clarifying questions and all of that kind of stuff. I don't know if I've necessarily given feedback in any other form. Definitely not an Excel spreadsheet. Definitely not PowerPoint. You know, but I do think it's always going to be. there's always going to be some kind of letter, whether it's physical or digital. But because of the nature of the way our industries work these days, it's usually digital.
Yeah.
Usually a digital conversation, usually a digital read-through and commentary. Sometimes some folks just want a phone call, and that's it, and they kind of tell me their ideas, and I kind of give them my answers back in that hour. And I do the best that I live sensitivity read, just like on the spot. Sometimes some folks only can afford that, and that's what they want, and I'm happy to do that. And so it's usually just verbal at that point. But that's the only time that it's just verbal. And even then, I will usually have thoughts afterwards that I send in a follow-up email, So there's usually some form of written.
What do you see as the publisher's or writer's obligation when they hire you?
To be aware of what what I have the ability to read for. Because I don't want them to think that a sensitivity reader is a catch-all.
Mm-hmm.
And so being like, this is the exact thing I want to hire you for, but also be aware that maybe I would be able to catch something that I would be like, you need to hire another editor or sensitivity reader for this thing. Because while I can read for what you need more than what I can give you.
That's a good sum up, actually.
Yeah.
Do you have any expectation that they will use all or any of your feedback?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a level of I tend to structure my letters in particular in the sense of, here are your red flags, here are your medium flags, and here are your tiny little fiddly bits that, if you don't take the fiddly bits, I'm not going to care. But the stuff at the very top that's in red, if you do not take that, we are going to have a problem, and I'm going to ask you to not credit me because you haven't taken my feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Credit is very important because credit is what shows that we have done the work. It is what builds our resumes. So people crediting us is very important, but if you do not take our feedback, do not credit us because you haven't taken our feedback and we haven't actually influenced your work. So yeah, my expectation is that you're going to take about 80 to 90% of my feedback, and if you don't, especially the red flags, we're going to have to do some talking.
Nice.
Well, but
The reason I had asked it, I was suspicious if there are people who hire sensitivity readers for the credit, not the work. I don't know if there are. I'm not calling anybody out, nothing like that. I was just wondering because sometimes I'm thinking with my critical hat, and are there companies that would use the name?
I can see how it would seem that way, but so there's two scenarios here, right? There's the scenario where somebody says, "Oh, I had a sensitivity reader," but refuses to name who they are. Why does that sensitivity reader not want to be known? And that usually means that there's probably a problem in the product.
Red flag.
And that's why.
In the interview.
Red flag. Red flag. If someone goes, "I had a sensitivity reader," but they won't name them, or that sensitivity refuses to be something is up. The other instance that I can see is situations in which a sensitivity reader was used and is named, but you're like, but that sensitivity reader missed this whole blank, and that may be because that wasn't within that sensitivity reader's realm of expertise. For example, I would not consider myself like the expert on disability consulting, right? And I would advocate for a disability consultant, a disability sensitivity reader to be brought on, because I know that I wouldn't be able to read for that. So if a work is published with a sensitivity reader who is present, and it still seems like something is off, it's either because there were not the right types of sensitivity readers or not enough sensitivity readers hired, or I've seen cases where the sensitivity reader was hired, but only got to look at the conceptual document and not the final draft.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
And there's a big difference between a conceptual document with your ideas and plot and all that kind of stuff and your final draft, because what word choice you use, how your language shapes things, and like the message that comes across in that final draft is very different. Like, your concepts can be completely well intentioned, but your wording in your final draft can not quite hit that mark, right? So anytime I'm dealing with a conceptual document, I let them know I cannot be the end-all be-all for you because I haven't seen your final version.
Yeah.
On that specifically, if we have a second.
We do. This show's your show, not my show.
Hey, fair enough. I have less direct experience with consulting for TTRPGs, but I play a lot of them and I write for a couple. And I know that the language of rules dictates a lot about the kinds of stories people are drawn to telling with them.
Oh.
And if you're not careful with sensitive topics, especially bigotry, disability is a big one. If you're not careful about how you word the way people interact with those concepts, you can perpetuate a lot of very harmful things very easily. And I know, I can't remember the name exactly, but there was a little bit of a kerfuffle earlier this year about one TTRPG that had missed the mark with that. And it's just made me think, like, I don't know how many of these writers, like, really take the time to think about how people will engage with the wording of those rules or the way they create characters. But it is definitely a point of focus. And in my home games, I try to structure things that way, to, like, help shape people's understandings of the world they'll be playing in and how to explore difficult topics, especially in horror, and that's my specialty.
Nice. Yeah, I can see it. Like, I'm getting ready to run a horror TTRPG starting October 3rd. I'm going to be running Old Gods of Appalachia, which is a Monty Cook product. And there's a lot of sensitive topics in it. And addressing those topics in session 0 was the first most important thing that I did, and probably always is, just so everybody understands what's going to happen and what will not be part of the game. So, you know, it's an alternate Appalachia, so a lot of things aren't going to be there. So let's talk a little bit about world building, because that led me to my world. I have questions about world building now, because we've talked a lot about publishing and all that. But world building is also an aspect of sensitivity reading. It's not only being brought in to read writers, it's also being brought in to talk about concepts and early development ideas, right? So when you're brought in with people doing world building, what is your preferred starting point? Is it history or biology or geography or something else entirely that you want to, like, lock onto and build out from? And why? You know, wherever you go, why is it there that you lock onto? Culture or...
A little bit of everything for me. World building for me as a sensitivity reader is people come to me with their ideas and they kind of throw them at me and I go, oh, that reminds me of this thing, or you should check out this thing. Especially when you folks come to me in the conceptual stage, I do a lot of, you should also check out this thing, and this thing, and this thing, and I end up throwing a bunch of links at them, especially if they want to do things that I said they should inspire. I'm able to provide a lot of resources, and they'll be like, oh, you should check out this hilarious YouTube video that explains this concept really well. So that is kind of what world building looks like for me, is it's kind of like, based on whatever kind of like things that I have experienced that as you are talking I'm reminded of, that might be useful reference points for you to check out and look at. And that's kind of how I do it personally, but that may not be true across the board. But I try to take kind of more of the like a idea bouncing off board situation, while also making sure that the ideas that you are bouncing off are not going to lead you into a pitfall later down the road, you know?
Yeah.
For sure. And I love world building because when I'm not playing in APs, which is often, unfortunately, I am a perpetual GM, so I world build a lot.
Yeah.
Like the current campaign I'm planning, I have the map right here, but I really like culture, talking about cultures and geography.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes, I try to, and this is testing myself as well, because obviously even as a sensitivity reader, I'm not going to know everything about every culture ever. So it's fun to create worlds that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
And do my own reading, because obviously I can't hire, I would love to hire friends and everything to help me world build, but unfortunately that's not possible all the time.
Yeah.
So and I think this is where a lot of people miss it too, is it's not necessarily that they don't do their own research, they just don't know where to look, which I think is another useful thing sensitivity readers can do, is here are some sources for you to do your own research if you can't hire us.
I really like that. And when I do world building, especially as a fellow forever GM, I usually start either with culture or religion. I like using religion as a jumping off point because it can be such a major part of, especially in fantasy, how the world is shaped and how people grew around it. And I think it makes for an interesting jumping off point because you can get into different things like philosophy or art or language and how those things like shape one another. And as an Afro-Celtic woman, I come from sort of an eclectic mix of like understandings of the world, and if people come to me asking about like how different cultures will mix with each other, even if they in the context of the world have no real reason to, aside from just the flow of time, I like helping tease out the what ifs. And I think starting with like big world spanning questions helps with that. Because it lays the foundation for whatever you want to build on top of it.
Yeah. And in world building, a lot of times, we get to simplify from the extrapolations of the real world. The real world is so much more complicated. I mean, how many fantasy games actually have more than one language that everybody speaks? Realistically. Everybody speaks common, whatever that means. But in the real world, nobody speaks common. There's no common. We haven't gotten Esperanto to take foot anywhere, so we're all stuck with like no language communication. We have one set of godhood in fantasy, and in the world we have thousands of godhoods, and I think that creates kind of the complexity the real world is stuck with, that we can kind of play with, like in religion or whatever, in fantasy or even science fiction, where it's little bits of the world, of the real world, are dropped in, but not the crazy mix that happened to be there at any one time. So you said you start with religion. So what of these things, because I had a religion question here and I thought it was very interesting, and that you even brought it up and started it. When you look at belief systems, do you concern yourself with religion versus spirituality, godhood, prayer and dogma, higher and lower powers, and the results on the culture? Or do you look at it more as just a pantheon?
Yes. That's going to be my answer to a lot of your questions. They're good questions. The answer is yes. Oh god. So, to give an example, I have a lot of experience with. My home games are set in a world I've been building for a few years called Shikale. It's like, from a religion lens, it's based in animism of a kind. Like, there are spirits everywhere. They're as much a part of nature as anything else. Some of them have, because of their domains, they have become more prominent, and some of them have started to be worshipped beyond, like, local relationships with people that happened to be around. And it sort of blends into this pseudo-pantheon sort of deal. Like, there are creatures that people would consider gods, or patron spirits, or just, like, local elementals, or what have you. I think places like that, it's a fun way to bring in some of that real-world complexity, because the answer to what constitutes something that you could worship and what that worship could look like is going to change from person to person.
Yep.
And I think it's fun to explore that, even if you don't have a lot of players or characters that are going to engage with it on that level. It can help inform a lot of what they interact with, like, secondarily.
Yeah. I mean, it's so sad for world builders that so little of what they do gets to be seen. It's all background for one person running all these games. The GM might get to see it, and if you're the one creating it, you get to. But you can't give it all out to everybody. They'll be like, "Oh, now we know too much."
There's a novel.
Yes,
pretty much.
Building.
I've been writing this book. It's gonna bore you to tears, but there's a lot of cool stuff in it. Do Monroe and Leona, do you work with religion in your sensitivity reading? Is that something that you take into context when you're reading? Or are there religious sensitivity readers? I can imagine there are sensitivity readers specifically for religion. I haven't heard of one, but I can imagine it.
It's definitely an area that is worth sensitivity reading. Like, I will sensitivity read for Hinduism for sure, because I'm familiar with that.
Okay.
I am not much of a world builder myself, so but I do sensitivity read for world building. As I was kind of saying in chat, I will always bring things back to real world equivalencies when I'm unpacking concepts for folk, just to make it easy for them to understand the nuances. But yeah, outside of that, I'm going to let Monroe answer.
I would love to sensitivity read for religion more, especially as someone who has a very unorthodox practice myself. Like I'm an omnist who believes in all religions, but I only practice a certain one. So it's very interesting. Especially world building a religion, it's very galaxy brain to me, so I don't do it as much. I prefer to, like, when I start world building, more on a spiritual level than a religious level.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's something I would love to do. I'm just still also learning my own practice. Like I said earlier, I would love to sensitivity read as a curandero, which is, in simple words, a Mexican medicine man. That's what I'm trying to do. So I would love to learn more and work more in that field.
Nice. Earlier, in the green room before we came on, you were talking about reading for neurodiversity and gender concerns. How do you handle that in your sensitivity reading? If you're brought in for other stuff and you see these concerns, do you mark them also Or do you wait for another sensitivity reader specifically brought on for that? Like, honestly, I'm trying to get to the process and how far you will reach, how far you'll let your grasp go into these things. Because I think all of them are important and valid, and I don't think any one is more or less important to be addressed.
It's kind of like I was saying earlier, where I will read something and I will see something that I would go, this I'm not familiar with, you should find a sensitivity reader for it.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's something that catches me off guard, or something that I wasn't originally hired for, I will make a comment about it and be like, hey, I know this isn't what I was hired for, but this is something that needs to be addressed. Because I feel like you hired me for a job, I should do my job.
Yeah.
Very whole person. I'm not gonna, just because you hired me for this one aspect, I'm not gonna stop myself and wait for someone else. No, you're getting everything. Like, let's be very clear. Like, you're getting everything. You get the whole person looking at your whole script. I'm gonna give you the whole everything. Like, I just, you know, I would never want to shortchange a client like that and, like, potentially let something slip through. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So, no, absolutely.
Definitely.
You get all of it. I when you ask me to sensitivity read, I have no boundaries. If it is within my realm of lived experience and knowledge, I will talk about it and I will address it. And if it's not within my realm of lived experience and knowledge and I feel like it needs addressing, I will point it out and say, hey, you should get someone to look at that for you. And if you need a referral, I might know someone, you know? But that's purely because I can't speak to it.
Right.
Y'all nailed that.
I think it's very rare that I've had the opportunity to kind of almost subcontract, where it's like I've been on behalf of that client, been able to reach out to a sensitivity reader and be like, I need your thoughts on this passage because it's literally just this paragraph. And like, I've been able to do that once or twice, but it's very rare. Normally it's kind of like on a person-to-person base, but who knows what the future holds.
I'm going to give you a scenario. And actually, I think I want to start with Junie answering this one because they weren't as involved in the last one. So you get a sensitivity read, you get a product. It reads terrific. They take your notes. There weren't even that many notes. They were already pretty on topic. But everybody in it is cisgendered.
Okay.
That's the question. I'm leaving it up to you.
Okay.
What do you do with that?
It depends. Like, there are instances where adding more diverse perspectives will help deepen the story or deepen whatever they're trying to accomplish. But if the author, the client, is very adamant about keeping things a certain way, I will sometimes ask them, because I have actually had that exact scenario.
I see a lot of games that are exactly that.
I will ask them, like, why it's necessary. Not necessarily critically, just trying to get into their heads, like, why this specifically? What sort of story are you trying to tell with it? And how much would it change if you changed that detail? I think it's that situation opens the door for more dialogue, and if the author or the client is willing to explore it, their perspective might change. But if they're happy with how it is, then at the end of the day, that is their decision. That's my take on it, at least.
Okay.
How would y'all approach it?
Yeah, and for me, especially as being trans and genderqueer, it depends on why is it important? Like, does it add anything to the story you're telling?
Right.
Especially because if you want to add someone who isn't cis, it's just like, does it do anything for the story you've already told? Like, is it necessary?
I'm going to have a little pushback on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you don't mind me jumping in for a moment. TTRPGs are not novels. They're meant for a collaborative environment of players that are not the creators. So by creating that, you're not leaving space to the players, not, you know, they're not just readers. So maybe maybe I'm overstepping my bound. I'm not a sensitivity reader.
No, you're pointing out something, actually.
Yeah.
So we approach this question from the point of this is a novel, right? And if it's a novel, we're going to say, well, is the author cis? Because if the author is cis, then they don't necessarily have the knowledge to deal with, like, they themselves don't have the lived experience to add, like, trans perspectives and things like that. So they would need another sensitivity reader to guide them at bare minimum, right? Or to look over at bare minimum. So you're asking another level of work that may not be financially viable. Is kind of also one of the considerations that I would have for a novel specifically, right? But this goes back to, what are we working on? Is it a novel or a tabletop RPG or a board game or a movie or, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, in a situation like a tabletop RPG, I would be more likely to encourage them to consider something like that because it leaves room for trans players, right? And I would encourage them to look into that and create those opportunities for their players. Whereas with someone who is a novelist, if it's not added to the narrative, as you both said, or if it's, you know, not within the realm of the comfort zone of that author, trying to push that on unnecessarily, quote unquote unnecessarily, like if it does not serve the purpose of what's already there, right, it's not quite, like, if the intention is to do it for the sake of doing it, it's not going to help anything, right?
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing, is I think as sensitivity readers, we never push for something for the sake of pushing for it, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
Diversity of expression versus brownie points. Yes, correct, Issy, thank you.
That was a great
10
response.
10 points for chat. 10 points for chat.
Totally.
And that's the biggest thing, right? But again, it's, what's the project? Tabletop RPG? Whole nother ballgame, because now it's about, well, how are the players going to interact with this, right? Versus how is the reader and how is the author going to interact with this. Now it's, how is a GM going to interact with this? How is a player going to interact with this? How can we leave room and gaps in there? Because tabletop RPGs inherently cannot fill in all the gaps, or there's no room for storytelling, right? There's no room for creativity. So you have to learn to figure out where those gaps are so that people can make those gaps themselves. Otherwise, they'll take your tabletop RPG and they'll make their characters trans anyways. Like, people just do that on a daily basis.
Yep.
You know? They'll be like, I'm going to gender flip this character. Go off. You know? Absolutely, go for it. We encourage you to leave room for it if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have one more question, and it is for, I always ask at the very end of the night, what would you tell somebody new coming into the industry trying to become a sensitivity reader? What guidance would you give them? Because there are always new people coming up, and we got to help them and support them and create more of the better and the awesome that you guys are.
One thing that I'm also working on is know your worth. Know that even if someone can't hire you, that it's you don't have to push down your rates unless it's something you actually, even then, I don't think you should push down your rates for someone. Like, if they need you, they will make time for you.
Okay.
I would say, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Definitely.
When you're getting your feet in the water for the first time, it is a little terrifying because you want to get everything right, and that can be paralyzing sometimes. You can get very stuck in not knowing how to do things a certain way, but you're not alone. It is an industry, and we're pretty friendly people. If you're stuck or you're not sure how to go about it, reach out.
Nice.
Yeah. Along those lines, the biggest learning curve for me was the freelance part of it, the business part of it. I was a communications major. Yeah, right? And I think we all feel it. I was a communications major, and that was the best decision ever because it informed so much of how I unpack things for my clients and how I explain concepts to my clients.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really great at my consulting. Learning the business skills, I did not go to business school and I regret it. And that was a whole other set of skills that I had to learn. The invoicing, the bookkeeping, the every little other thing. It is a lot to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And as Julie said, do not hesitate to reach out and ask for help. Like I've never turned away anyone who has asked me questions, whether they wanted to be a sensitivity reader or wanted to hire a sensitivity reader. I will gladly answer every question under the sun, because I know that we're all still trying to figure it out, and those business skills are kind of hard to figure out sometimes, and I've learned all of them by the seat of my pants. So please reach out, ask for help, because you're not in it alone, and I think that's the biggest thing that plagues us as sensitivity readers, is that we feel alone sometimes. So please.
And join your soon-to-be built Discord server for sensitivity readers.
I guess so, yeah. I'm trying to listen, I gotta collect all the sensitivity readers. I gotta catch them all like Pokemon, I guess.
Yep. You go to the cons with a table.
I'm just gonna go to the cons with a table and like have a little Discord QR code and I can be like, sensitivity reader, sensitivity reader, sensitivity reader, bing, bing, bing. I'm kidding.
All right. Well, we have reached the end of the night. I want to respect your time. I want to thank you. All three of you have been just amazing tonight. I've had the best time tonight. It's my favorite 2 hours of the week. Is just chatting about TTRPGs, and the three of you were just spectacular all night. Let's let everybody go around and say who they are, where they can be found. I'll drop the links in chat. Why don't we go backwards from where we were last time? We'll start with you, Monroe, and go counterclockwise.
All right, I am Monroe. I use he, they pronouns. You can find me on Twitter at Monroe98, generally on the internet under Monroe, or on Instagram at Monroe Gaming. And I'm, aside from being a sensitivity reader, I'm also a writer, game designer, and editor.
Awesome. Junie.
Hi. Once again, I am Junie. I use she, her, or these and pronouns. You can find me anywhere on the internet, especially Twitter and Blue Sky, at Stellar Empress. You can see what I'm doing or catch up on my services at stellarcreative.card.co. And outside of that, I am a TTRPG writer and aspiring developmental editor. We'll see if I can get my foot in that door.
Very nice. We're cheering you on.
Thank you.
Leona.
Hello, I am Leona. I can be found all over the internet at the Leona Maple. The best place to find me and keep up with, oh my goodness, there's numerous cookie jars that I have my fingers in, is theleonamaple.card.co, and everything that I am doing lives on there so that you can know where to find me and see me pop up. As well as my socials. I am a sensitivity reader, DEI consultant. I do all of it as much as I can. I'm also a tabletop RPG roleplayer and performer. If you want to see me on your streams, I would love to be a part of them. And I do too many things, but I always want to do more.
Wonderful. Thank you. I am Scott. My pronouns are he, him, and you can find me always and everywhere at Zealzaddy on all the socials, and I do mean all the socials. TikTok is the only one that isn't Zealzaddy. It's Zealzaddy RPG. I've done very little there because I'm so bad at TikTok because I like conversation. It's so funny. I'm on video all the time, and I'm like, I don't like doing the videos. I don't like the short ones because I'm too wordy. For my YouTube viewers, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, and we will see you in a week on another awesome topic where we will get more interesting perspectives. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye, everybody.